Wes, for having us here today. Super excited about the opportunity. I'm kind of an art materials geek, so any opportunity to talk about art materials with everyone is my favorite thing to do. And today is one of my favorite subjects, and that's Cobra, which is our water mixable oils. So what I'm going to do is share a PowerPoint presentation, talk about Cobra, but more broadly, talk about oil paints in general and what makes water mixable oils work. And then going to turn it over to Cheryl, and she's going to bedazzle you yay. She's going to share with you one of the great features of Cobra, and that is working with the jelly plates and creating some really wonderful prints as a result. They're a great partnership. Our Amsterdam acrylics, I know, are a real popular partner as well, and we might get a peek at some of that too. But there is a unique result that you get with the oils, and I'm excited to see what Cheryl's going to do for you today. So why don't I go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started on the presentation. You should see it come up here. There we go. And then I'm going to make it even larger. All right, so join the Revolution, solvent-free oil painting. So when we're talking about water mixable oil colors, what we're really talking about is painting without solvents. Solvents, of course, are the spirits or turpentines that are used traditionally and historically with oils, both as a medium that's mixed in to make a leaner paint and also to clean up with. But those solvents have challenges. There are certainly safe ways to use them, but there are usually three reasons folks come to me and want to paint solvent-free. I think the primarily one is health. Right, so folks either have developed a sensitivity to solvents or are just outright allergic to them, or don't have a studio space that's well ventilated, which makes solvents really difficult to use because you need really good ventilation regardless of the type of solvents that you're using. So health is one of the main concerns that's driving folks to explore solvent-free oil painting. Then you have the environment. The disposal of solvents can be very challenging, especially in some jurisdictions. Counties, cities have pretty strict regulations on what you do with those things. So that can be a challenge to work with solvents. And I think lastly, but also significant, is just the convenience factor. I work with a lot of plein air painters, and the ability to travel can be hindered by having to bring solvents with them. So not having to worry about that or worry about trying to source it on their arrival and their destination is a big convenience. So health, environment, convenience are really the three things that are driving this movement. A couple things on Royal Talens, just in case this is your first introduction to them. Royal Talens is a Dutch company founded in 1899, and this is the original building that we were founded in a little town called Apeldoorn, which is about an hour east by train from Amsterdam. I was just there a few weeks ago. Fantastic little town, and always a privilege to see where we're making our products and do some investigating and learning there. And this, we're still on the same site as this building, which is pretty incredible all those years. One of our first product lines were Rembrandt watercolors and oils, and this is our 1901 catalog. And you can see the wood box display of the watercolors there. You're probably familiar with Rembrandt oils, watercolors, soft pastels, especially. That's one of our premier lines. We also make Van Gogh products, oils, watercolors, pastels. I mentioned Amsterdam, all acrylics, and then of course Cobra, which we'll be talking about today. This is a shot from inside in the 1930s. You can see these steam-powered paint mills. The technology has advanced, but it's really cool, I think, to take a peek at the history of art material making over the decades, and a fun picture. I wanted to share another one. I probably should have dug that one up too. There's actually pictures of the workers in there wearing their Dutch wooden shoes. So it's a great tradition of paint making. And then a lot of folks ask why we're called Royal Talens. So as you saw in that background image, it was originally the Martin Talens Company, or just straight out Talens. In 1949, Queen Wilhelmina, pictured here, gave us the royal predicate. So we essentially became paint makers to the Queen. And it was for our contributions to both the culture and economy of the Netherlands. And so we were honored to have that distinction in 1949 and have proudly served as the royal predicate since then. Cobra was introduced in 2010, so it's a fairly recent addition to the product lines. All of our experience making oil paints all the way back to 1899 went into the making of this product, and there probably has not been a more thoroughly tested oil paint in the history of oil paint making. So lots of science and experience behind the product line. And then today, established in 2015, is Royal Talens North America. So Royal Talens is an international company with affiliates that are global. And the North American affiliate began in 2015 in Northampton, Massachusetts, which is where our distribution center is. Of course, you've been able to get our products for many years. I think the first Rembrandt oils were available in the 1930s in the US. But they were always distributed through a third party. So now we have our own distribution center, and it gives us a much easier way to service our customers here. My background is I'm an artist exhibiting now for more than 30 years. I've been in the art materials industry for over 20 years, wearing many hats, but art education is my passion. And then I taught at university for 10 years, primarily studio art, but also some art history. And you can learn more about me at jeffolsonart.com. All right, so today's agenda, why Cobra? And here I'm going to answer the question I could probably get more is why we call it Cobra to begin with. And then a really, really brief history of oil paints. And then I'm going to talk about what a binder is. And then we'll get into the drying oils, which are the binders for oil paints. And then I'm going to share with you briefly some of the different types of oil paints that are available and have been available historically. Then we're going to talk about an emulsifier, maybe a term that's familiar to some, unfamiliar to others, but it's the secret ingredient that makes water mixable oils work. And we'll explore emulsifiers in art because there's actually a very long history and tradition in this type of chemistry when it relates to painting materials specifically. And then I'm going to briefly talk about determining quality, comparing artist versus study. We have both an artist grade and a study grade of Cobra, but what I will share with you today can be used as a gauge just in general to talk about the difference between professional materials and academic materials. Then I'm going to briefly talk about the auxiliaries. So these are the mediums that you can use with Cobra that are made specifically under that brand. And then I'm going to hopefully dispel some of the myths that surround water mixed oils. There's a lot of misinformation out there about them, what they do, how they're made, how they work. And so I want to give you some facts and then a couple tips too, both from the professional artists I work with who use Cobra and my own experience as well. And then, of course, we have our demo at the end. All right. So why Cobra? So as you notice with some of the other brands, Rembrandt, Van Gogh, Amsterdam, Royal Talens always tries to link in something to the cultural heritage of the Netherlands, and Cobra is no exception. There was a post-World War II movement that was started by artists from Copenhagen, Brussels, and Amsterdam, and they titled it Cobra after the initials of each of the home cities. So the CO is for Copenhagen, the BR for Brussels, and the A for Amsterdam. It was a movement, a group of painters primarily, who were interested in breaking with the conventions of traditional oil painting. You can see an image in the background here by Karel Appel. He was the Dutchman. It doesn't look that revolutionary now, but at the time, it was linked to surrealism, specifically automatism, which means automatic or just creating the work without predetermination. They were inspired by Nordic myths, by children's art, by what they called primitivism, what today we would refer to as outsider art. So anything that was against tradition, and this quote I have here, "We do not want to be understood, we want to be freed." That was Karel Appel. We took that as an inspiration for Cobra because what we're looking to do with Cobra is to free ourselves from the conventions of having to use solvent with our oils. So we shared in spirit the mission of the Cobra painters, and that's where the inspiration for the name comes for the brand. All right, in the beginning, so oil painting. A lot of folks think of oil painting as beginning in the Renaissance, and we certainly see in the West anyways, an explosion of artists interested in using and implementing oil paints. But oil paints actually go back much further. The oldest known oil paintings were discovered in Afghanistan in some caves in the Bamiyan region. They were dated all the way back to the 7th century CE. And these paintings were done on the walls of caves, an extensive labyrinth of caves, and from floor to ceiling, and they all depicted the life cycles of Buddha. And when they analyzed the materials, they found that they were painted with a binder that was a combination of walnut oil and poppy seed oil, which are binders that are still used today in the making of oil paints. And we've always looked at these, I guess, since their discovery, and based on the level of expertise in their execution, you have to imagine that the use of oils predates these probably by some time, and we just haven't discovered it yet. So oil painting is a very old medium, has been with us for centuries. Of course, we get into the Renaissance, the 15th century, the early Renaissance, specifically in the North, and we see the use of oil paint begin to dominate expression for painters. So prior to oil paints, we had tempera, which is egg yolk mixed with pigment. We also saw fresco, which is painting directly into wet plaster, encaustics, which was using hot wax as a binder. All these paints are wonderful, but they had limitations, and oil paint offered many advantages. First of all, its tonal range was much broader than these other mediums. The amount of pigments and color that you could get was much stronger. You could actually get more pigment into the mixture. The oil binders accepted the pigment more readily. Because the paint stayed wet longer, all these other mediums dried rather quickly. The ability to blend and represent the look and feel of the natural world was much easier. And this was in line with the humanist ambitions of Renaissance painters, this desire to create or replicate the beauty of the natural world as we see it. So a real revolutionary idea, and oil paint helped to make it a reality. And in this image, you can see, of course, a supposed self-portrait of Van Eyck. We're not 100% sure that's him, but it's pretty accepted that it's him. And then one of his paintings of the Virgin and Child in the background. So wonderful application of materials that's still techniques that we use today. All right, something that doesn't get mentioned a lot in art history, especially as it relates to oil painting, but had a very significant impact, was the invention of the oil tube in 1841 by this dapper gentleman. This is John Rand, and he was an American living in Great Britain. He invented this tube, and it really changed the way that artists painted and used their materials. So prior to the tube, this was the most common way to store your paints. And this is a pig's bladder that's tied up and corked with a piece of wood. This is actually from the studio of Gainsborough. These images here, they're actually his bladders of paint. And it was a very challenging way to store paint, certainly a challenging way to use it in the field. And the tube did two things. One, it enabled artists to travel more easily, paint on site. A lot of artists attribute, a lot of art historians attribute the tube to contributing to an Impressionist movement in the late 19th century. It also broadened the demographic of individuals who could paint. So we have enthusiasts now, not just professionals who had access to the materials. And we see a real explosion in the latter part of the 19th century of an interest in oil painting in the general public. So in a way, you could say the tube democratized oil painting for the masses, if you will. All right, so what is a binder? So binders are really important when talking about paints. It's really the binder that determines the characteristics of the material. Everybody hear me okay still? I'm getting a little static.
Yes.
Okay. All right, perfect. So what is a binder? So in its most general terms, a binder is a liquid that hardens through a chemical or physical process and binds the particles, in this case, pigments, together. The primary functions of a binder are to suspend and to adhere, and we refer to that as suspension and adhesion. And let me explain that for a second. So pigments do not dissolve. Think of them as grains of sand, if you will. If you mix them in water and stir them up, they'll disperse, but they eventually will sink down to the bottom. So when you have a binder, it really is important that that binder suspends those pigments in place once the paint is mixed together, and that they don't sink or separate back down to the bottom. So suspension is really important feature or function of a binder. The second is adhesion. You've got to put it on a surface, right? It's got to stick to the canvas that you're painting on. So almost all binders are excellent adhesives or have excellent adhesive properties. You could say that a third property would be to create a paint film. That's how we define it, right? It hardens their physical process, but not all binders do this. One example is gum arabic. Gum arabic is the primary binder for watercolors, but doesn't create a discernible paint film. It's actually absorbed into the surface of the paper. And that's one of the reasons you can reactivate or lift the pigments back up off the paper afterwards, because there is no paint film. So while it's one of the ways we define a binder, really the most important functions are its ability to suspend and adhere the pigments. And then in general, and I mentioned this at the beginning of this, a binder is what gives any paints its primary working properties. The pigments are universal. So we use the same pigments in acrylics and oils and watercolors. It's the binder that gives each of those its unique working properties. All right, so the drying oils are the group of oils that are used as binders for the making of oil paints. So a drying oil is one that hardens or dries to a hard, strong, and durable film. The oil hardens through a chemical reaction referred to as oxidation. So this makes it unique. So when we look at acrylics that have an acrylic polymer emulsion as a binder, or watercolor, the gum arabic I mentioned, they dry through a process of evaporation. So they're literally losing moisture into the environment. It's a very rapid process, rapid chemical process. Oxidation is kind of the opposite. What's happening with the oil is it's actually absorbing oxygen from the atmosphere, and it's a very slow chemical process. But eventually it oxidizes, is probably the more appropriate way. It doesn't really dry, it's oxidizing or hardening to create its paint film. So that's one of the unique features of the binder and of the drying oils. A drying oil is a vegetable oil essentially, but not all vegetable oils will dry to harden to create a paint film. And I'm going to share with you here just some of the primary ones that you'll encounter in oil painting. So linseed oil, we're probably all familiar with, those of us who are oil painters out there. Linseed oil is the most popular used in the manufacture of oils today and for centuries. It comes from the flaxseed, and you can see in the image here some flax seeds. Same ones you find at the Whole Foods grocery store. Somebody asked me, well, why don't we call it flaxseed oil? And in fact, we do. Lin, in Old English and Norse language, is the word for flax. So linseed is essentially saying flaxseed, just like when we say linen, which is another flax product, it's meant to be flax. So that's where the term comes from. Linseed is the fastest drying of the drying oils. I know that sounds kind of like oxymoron since it takes so long to dry, but compared to other drying oils, it's fairly rapid. It makes the strongest and most durable paint film, which is what has made it the most popular, along with its drying. The only downside to linseed oil is it can yellow over time, depending on how much oil is in the paint itself. You really don't notice it in many colors, but you can see it in whites and lighter colors over time. So that's the downfall of linseed. But beyond that, it is the preferred binder for oil paints, especially the manufacture of oil paints. Another popular one, and the most popular during the Renaissance, was walnut oil. Just like it says, it was made from pressing walnuts. It also makes a strong and durable paint film, not quite as strong as linseed oil, but fairly equitable. It dries fairly quickly, not as quickly as a linseed oil binder, but close. And it's non-yellowing. So that's one of the reasons it was preferred and is still preferred by many artists, especially as a medium that they add into the paint. There are only a few brands that actually still use walnut oil in the manufacture of it. It's used primarily as an additive by painters today, and sometimes as a substitute for solvents. So it's a way to work with traditional oil solvent-free to use walnut oil to clean your brushes. The one downside to walnut oil is it can rot. in its fluid form in a bottle. And you will know when that happens because it smells horrible. It's like there's something dead in your studio. So artists who use these typically refrigerate their walnut oil in between uses. Once it cures or oxidizes, that's not a worry anymore. Next is safflower oil. Safflower comes from the type of thistle. You can see the bloom here in the picture. It is very popular today in the manufacture of whites. I mentioned the yellowing properties of linseed oil. Safflower is a non-yellowing oil, so it's often added to linseed oil in the manufacture of whites to prevent the yellowing down the road. It's a little slower drying than linseed or walnut oil, which is, some of you who may have noticed this working with oil paints, your whites take a little longer to dry. Part of that is the pigment, but the other part is that often safflower oil is in the mixture, and therefore those colors take a little longer to dry than others. Safflower oil makes a fairly soft paint film, which is why it's not often used by itself. It's usually always used in the combination or partnered with another type of drying oil. And then finally, poppy seed oil. Poppy seed oil, as I mentioned in those frescoes, or not frescoes, that would be the inappropriate term, the murals that were painted with oils in Afghanistan, they were done with a combination of walnut and poppy seed oil. Poppy seed oil is still a popular medium today, and it's also used a lot in the making of varnishes. It's a lighter oil. It is slower drying, very similar to safflower oil, and non-yellowing, which is one of the reasons it's preferred in the making of varnishes. So those are some of the drying oils, the ones that you would probably most often come into contact with today as mediums or binders in paint. All right, so this brings us to different types of oil paint. So traditional oil paints are those that are made with a drying oil like the ones we discussed. Sometimes solvents are added to the paint, extenders, there are a variety of proprietary methods depending on the manufacturer. But basically, a traditional oil paint is one that is made of pigment and a drying oil. Another popular type of oil paint, modern type of oil paint, is alkyd. And you may have come across alkyd mediums. They're very popular today, but there are some brands of paint that are made with an alkyd binder. So an alkyd is a type of drying oil that's synthesized with a alcohol and an acid. And that's the original name, was called alcyd. So it comes from the initials or the beginnings of those two words. And it's synthesized together. It was originally done by General Electric to make coatings for electrical wires. I believe it was the 20s or 30s that was done. It wasn't long after that it was commercialized in making of house paint. So most oil-based house paints today have some type of alkyd resin as their base. And the advantage to alkyd over traditional oils is it dries much more quickly. So we're talking dries completely in a matter of days rather than months to completely cure for traditional oil painting. And that appealed to artists. So it wasn't long before we see artist brands made with alkyd resins for this feature of drying more quickly. There were some downsides though. Alkyds don't hold as much pigment, so the colors aren't quite as vibrant, and not as many pigments are as compatible with the alkyd resins. So you usually have a broader choice of colors in traditional oils. Today, there are many alkyd mediums available that you can add to traditional oils. So alkyd paints themselves are not that well distributed like they were when they first came out because of that. And then finally, water miscible oils. Water miscible oils are where the binder, the drying oil, most cases linseed oil, has been synthesized so that it will accept water. And there are different ways that is done. And I'm going to explain how we do it here with Cobra. So let's talk about what an emulsifier is, because that's the secret ingredient. So an emulsifier on a molecular level consists of what we call a hydrophilic head and a lipophilic tail. Hydrophilic in Greek literally means water-loving. Lipophilic in Greek literally means fat-loving. In this case, we're going to call it oil-loving tail. And you can see the little diagram here where we have the fat molecule floating around in the water, and the emulsifiers have attached itself to the oil, and it's bonding with the water. Now, emulsifiers are everywhere. They're in our bodies. They're in most organic matter. Emulsifiers help kind of hold the fats and water together. That's certainly what's happening in our bodies. We find it in a lot of food products. Salad dressings, for example, use it. Mayonnaise is an emulsion, if you will. And anything where we take two ingredients like oil and water and we hold them together with an emulsifier is referred to as an emulsion. All right, so emulsifiers in art. There have been several over the ages. It isn't something that's brand new. A lot of folks, and this is one of the myths, that this type of process is somehow just a modern invention. It's actually a very old chemistry, and it's also related to many ways that art has been making paint. One of the first, and I mentioned this before, is tempera. So tempera is where you use the egg yolk mixed with pigments and water as a vehicle. And the reason you can mix water with this animal protein is because it includes a molecule called lecithin, which is a type of emulsifier. It has that water-loving and fat-loving, and it enables it to bond with both water and oil, in this case, an animal protein and water. So there's an example of a very ancient painting medium that is a type of emulsion. Casein paint, you may have heard of, is a milk protein as the binder. The Egyptians used casein paint. And again, water is used as a vehicle for it, and that's because the milk itself contains, again, that emulsifier called lecithin. So you're seeing the recurring theme here. The presence of lecithin is what makes this all possible. And in today's water mixable oils, we're using lecithin from soy. So we're extracting the lecithin from soybeans, and synthesizing that with the linseed oil to allow it to accept water. Soy is actually a drying oil. It's a very slow drying oil, and it doesn't create a very hard paint film, but it is used by some painters to mix in with linseed oil, not because they want to mix their paint with water. They're just looking to change the working properties of their paint. But it does include that special ingredient, soy lecithin. It's an ingredient you find in a lot of food products, and you start looking at the ingredients on the back, you'll come across soy lecithin quite often. All right, so determining quality. So switching gears here from what makes it work to talking about the quality of the different paints available. So we have both a student grade and an artist grade. But like I said in the beginning, this applies to really any comparison between artist paints and study paints. So one of the first things to compare that you probably would guess is pigmentation. Artist paints can have as much as twice as much pigment than a student grade paint. So the average tube of professional paint will have about 50% pigment, 50% binder. Some can have more pigment, some can have less. It all depends on the surface tension of the pigment and its ability to absorb or work with the binder, and that determines the pigmentation. And in a study grade, typically what we do is we cut that in half and we add what's called an extender or a filler. And these essentially are transparent pigments that reflect the mass tone of the pigment, give the paint out of the tube a very similar look as if it was a fully loaded pigmented paint. But when you start mixing the paint or tinting it, for example, that's when you'll really notice the difference in the quality between the two. It's a test I like to show people often between the two, and it's pretty dramatic, the difference. So if you're painting with the paint right out of the tube and not mixing a lot of colors, a study grade paint can be just fine for underpaintings, for example, for murals. But if you're doing any kind of serious mixing of colors or you're working from a restricted palette, you really want to be working with an artist paint that enables you to mix better colors. Milling or grinding. Now, this is something a lot of folks don't know and don't appreciate the importance of. It really is as important as how much pigment is in it. So you saw some of those old paint mills at the beginning of the presentation. Essentially, it's giant rolling pins that are stacked upon each other, and the paint mixture, the binder and the pigment pre-mixed, is fed through it. And what happens is two things. One, the pigment clusters are ground down to smaller sizes, and then they're also dispersed more effectively through the paint. An artist or professional paint can be milled several times. The average size of the pigment cluster that we're looking for is anywhere between 25 and 35 microns. 5 microns is the diameter of a human red blood cell, 60 microns the diameter of a human hair. So that's quite small if you're talking in comparison to those. And the finer the grind, the more luminescent the paint, the better the dispersion, the better mass tone and color you're going to have overall. Student grade paints sometimes are not ground or milled at all. Sometimes they're just mixed, or they're just put through 1 or 2 times, and the size of the pigments can be twice as large as the pigment size of a professional paint. So pigmentation and milling equally important. Light fastness. Now, this is something that, of course, is really important to artists who are interested in the archival nature of the materials. Light fastness for artist grade paints is typically an excellent light fast rating. That's 100+ years under museum light conditions. And all of the colors in a professional line of paint will be at that level or near it. There are some good colors too that are often included. In study lines, you can find some of those same light fast pigments, but very often less expensive pigments or even dyes sometimes are used, which are not light fast at all. They're what we refer to as being fugitive. In the Cobra study, we actually have a large number of excellent light fast pigments, so that's not an issue there. So it really depends on the brand and the choices they're making in the pigmentation. Exclusive colors. So what is an exclusive color? So those are pigments that are typically only used in the making of artist materials. Those are your cobalts and your cadmiums, for example. Super expensive to manufacture and source. Cadmium comes from very few locations, most of it from Africa, although there are some cobalt mines that are opening up in North America here soon. But it is a very expensive pigment. You wouldn't find it in house paint. It'd be a very expensive house paint if you were working with cobalt. So artist grade materials will use those. Study grades will typically take those out, remove those more expensive pigments so that the price is more economical across the line. The color range in an artist grade would be much larger. Our Rembrandt line, for example, has 120 colors. Student grade colors, because they are taking out some of those exclusive colors and reducing the number of colors overall that may cost more, you have a smaller color range. And I'll show you a comparison between the artist and the study here in a second. Series. So you probably come across this at any paint rack. If you look up, it'll be a series card, series 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and beyond with some brands. It isn't a difference in quality. Series 1 paints are just as good as Series 5 paints. It's all about the exclusivity of the pigment. So if the pigment is expensive, rare, hard to find, hard to manufacture, then those are going to be higher series numbers and therefore more expensive. In student lines, typically there are only 1 or 2 series points. All those expensive colors have been taken out to provide more economical choices for the artist. And here's a comparison between the artist colors and the study colors. And you can see with the artist colors, we have several of the cobalts and cadmiums included, as well as some of the what we would call convenience colors mixtures. In the study, it's really pared down to mostly monopigmented colors and none of those exclusive colors. All right. So auxiliaries. So we do have some mediums. Anybody who's an oil painter out there usually uses some type of medium, even if it's just an addition of linseed oil to their paint. And the reason to use auxiliaries can be to change the consistency of the paint, to make it thinner, to make it thicker, to increase the transparency or make it more opaque, to shorten the drying time, or to change the finish, the look of your painting. You can mix them directly in to the paint on your palette, or you can dip your brush into them as you go. And my tip, and I'll repeat this in a second, moderation is the key. Now, I recommend using these mediums, one or more of them with Cobra. I think they make the whole painting experience more enjoyable. But if I were only to pick one, it would probably be the painting medium or the quick dry medium. Those are the most popular. The painting medium will make the paint thinner, extend more. It will make it more transparent. It does not affect the drying time, and it will make the paint a little glossier. It just makes the paint release on the surface, especially a canvas with a rough texture. The quick dry medium does all the same things with the addition of making the paint dry more quickly, 20 to 40% more quickly, depending on how much you put in. The painting paste is one of my favorite. It gives you the same consistency, the same finish as the paint out of the tube, makes it a little more transparent, extends the paint, really great for impasto techniques. We also make some varnishes, some spray varnishes in satin gloss and matte. One note on all varnishes contain solvents. So if you're getting into this to avoid solvents altogether, you may want to avoid varnishes altogether. And the reason varnishes have solvent in them is because they are applied with the intention of being removed at some point and replaced. And to be able to do that without damaging the underlying paint film, they need to have solvent as part of their ingredient. All right, some myths and tips. Let's get into the myths first. So water miscible oils contain water. I hear this a lot, water-based oil paints. They are not water-based. There's no water in the tube. Cobra is simply linseed oil that's been synthetically modified with that emulsifier, that soy lecithin, and the pigment. There's no water in the tube. It's a traditional oil paint for all intents and purposes. Oh, answered my own question there. Water miscible oils are not true oil paints. Some folks think that maybe the binder is different. Something is different that would make them not actually an oil paint, and that's not true. They are a true oil paint. Linseed oil is the binder for the paint. That they dry faster than traditional oils. And this is false. The paint binder is what determines the drying time, not the solvent that you add. Turpentine, actually, mineral spirits added to oil paint will evaporate much more quickly than water. So the addition of water to the paint in your painting process does not make the paint dry more quickly, any different than applying a solvent, right? So that's a false. A lot of folks think they work like acrylics. And this is false. Again, it's the binder that gives them their working properties. The working properties that you're familiar with oil painting will be exactly the same when you're using Cobra. That they cannot be mixed with traditional oils. This is false. You can use them in combination with any of the traditional oils that you may already have or purchase. They are a true oil paint in that regard. Can be mixed with acrylics. Now there's some debate about this. You certainly can paint them over a dried acrylic underpainting, just like you would with a traditional oil. There are some folks who will claim that you can paint with acrylics by mixing the colors on the palette in your painting process. We as a manufacturer don't recommend that. Oil paints oxidize, a very slow chemical process. Acrylics evaporate, very rapid process. For those of you who know the fat over lean principle for oil painting, where you're painting a more oil-rich over a leaner paint underneath, the reason to do that is because oil paints need to be able to absorb oxygen. If you cut that off, they dry improperly, and that can lead to cracking and all sorts of other tragedies on the surface. So when you mix the two together, it's hard to predict how that is going to affect the long-term health of the paint film. So as a manufacturer, we don't recommend that you mix with acrylics. Some folks think that they're not archival, that they aren't safe to use for paintings with the intention of them lasting for generations, and that's not true. As I mentioned at the very beginning, I don't think there's a paint that's been tested as much. I think most paints made in the 15th century probably would not pass conventional paint testing standards. The archival quality of Cobra is really undisputed. Have less pigment. So a lot of folks think there isn't as much color. And a lot of this comes from the first generations of water mixable oils that came out in the 70s and 80s. And these paints did not contain a lot of pigment. They weren't meant as a professional material. They were using a technology or chemistry that's different than the one we use today. It was more like in the making of a soap rather than a paint. Just a whole different animal, and having that experience has kind of tainted the idea of using it in the future. But the paints today have just as much pigment. Our Cobra Artist, for example, has the same pigment loads as our Rembrandt. All right, a few tips. When using Cobra mediums, moderation is best in the beginning. So get a feel for how it works before you start putting too much in. I recommend just getting a little on your brush and seeing how it feels with the paint on your palette, apply it to the surface, and then add as you see fit in terms of what you're trying to achieve as a painter. You can combine Cobra oils with traditional oils, and I mentioned that already, but if you maintain a 2-to-1 ratio, so 2 parts Cobra with 1 part traditional oil, that means that you can continue to use water. Now, this is just with the paints, not the mediums. So if you had a ultramarine blue Cobra and an ultramarine blue Rembrandt, and you wanted to extend the Rembrandt, if you use 2 parts Cobra, 1 part Rembrandt, you'll still be able to mix water. This is one of the things we do in the workshops I give, kind of put it to the test, and it works every time. It's really a great feature of the paint. If you have an investment of oil paints already, and you want to switch to solvent-free, water mixable, you don't have to get rid of those. You can incorporate that into the painting process. When you're mixing with water, it's recommended not to exceed a 1-to-1 ratio. This is the same recommendation with all solvents. Artists are always breaking this rule, especially in their underpaintings. As long as you are painting over those leaner layers, you're fine. This is all about the integrity of the paint film. You don't want finished layers of the paint to have a ratio that's less than this, or you'll have a paint film that hasn't bonded or cured completely. There are ways around this if you really like those drips on the surface of your painting. One technique is to mix, for example, the painting medium with water ahead of time 1-to-1, and then adding small amounts of color to that. It gives you a really fluid viscosity, allows you to create some really wonderful wet into wet techniques that you're looking for. Here's a resource. This will be on the recording, but if you want to take a screenshot, we have an online magazine, and it'll tell you everything you ever wanted to know about Cobra. And definitely a great resource. All the information on the brand, the colors, artist testimonials, some of the background and the history of the making of the paint, some fun information, and a great resource. And now the demo. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And we will have time for questions after Cheryl's done, but hopefully there was some good information for you, and I look forward to answering your questions at the end. All yours, Cheryl.
Thank you. That was a lot of information. I should have done that a while back. My name is Cheryl Baglioli, as they introduced, and I am the creative director for Gel Press. So I work for Gel Press, and we produce and manufacture the gel plates that many of our artists use. And there's a variety of different things that you can do with the gel plate. And one of the things that I do love about them is that they're reusable. So it's a tool that you're going to be able to use again and again and again. They're fairly indestructible. You can stretch them, you can wad them up, you don't have to worry about them, but they do take little imprints very easily. So just be careful how you store it, and you don't want to use anything solvent based with the gel plates either, because the solvent based will break down the polymer, because it's a mineral oil based polymer is how it is created. So I love playing with the gel plate just because it gives me the opportunity to, one, explore new mediums. So truth story here, Cobra is new medium to me. So I'm just learning how to play with it and work with it. And I can do that freely on a gel plate and some paper and not being worrying about, oh, I'm, wasting a canvas, or I'm wasting all these different things. And I can just kind of play and learn how the medium works. So that gives me the benefit of doing that. So today we're just going to talk about just some basic principles of working with a gel plate. And again, as they said, I'll be happy to answer any questions when it's over with. But when you first get your gel plate, and I'm just going to switch cameras here so you can see, it's going to come in a clamshell. So when you get the clamshell, it's going to come inside, and it's going to have Mylar attached to it. So they come with Mylar attached to them in the plate. When you get your plate, you take the Mylar off and you discard it. You can either recycle it, or you can use it as a paint palette, or cut it up and use it as a stencil. But one of the some people have said in the past that when you're done, put your Mylar back on to keep dust and hair and things like that out of your plate. But you don't want to do that, because what's going to happen is when you put your plate on, now you can see that I have these air bubbles that are trapped. And no matter how much you try to put this on nice and neat, there's always going to be these little air bubbles. And when these air bubbles are trapped on your plate, you're capturing those between your Mylar and your plate, and it's actually pushing down on your plate. and it'll create an indentation in your plate so that then when you try to do prints, you've always got those places that aren't picking up your pigments or your brayers going to because it's hitting those little air bubbles. So once you take that Mylar off, discard it, recycle it, use it again for another purpose. So that's one of the main things of just getting started. Also, when you get a brand new plate, a lot of times they'll resist, especially things like oils or alcohol inks, different things like that, because they are mineral oil based. So one thing that you can do when you first get a plate is, we call it seasoning your plate. And you can do that by either just putting paint on there and pulling a few prints, or I have found the easiest, fastest way to do it is just take a single piece of copy paper, just plain paper, and put it on your plate, give it a little rub, and then just take it off. And you've absorbed any excess oil that's sitting on the plate. You've also broken the surface tension. So now it's going to take the paints more readily when you're playing with them. So I think that's it for right now that I can think about getting started. So let's just play a little bit. Now, when I work, I like to have 2 plates always going at the same time, sometimes multiple ones, because, you know, while one thing's drying, you can work another. But I keep a smaller plate next to me all the time as a paint palette. And I really like that because I can mix my paints right on this. I can brayer it off. There's a variety of different ways that you can apply. So I'm just using a brayer, and I have a little bit of paint here. I think I need a little bit more than that. And I could put some medium in here to make this go a little bit further if I wanted to, most definitely. And you can just kind of run your brayer around, or you can go back and forth just to kind of break that up on there. I could have applied it directly to this plate also, but I like having a little bit, this gives me more control over exactly where I'm going with it. So now with this, I'm using one of our brand new plates. Our plates come in a variety of different sizes. So this one here is the new A4 plate. And I love this because I'm playing with the Cobra paper. That's what I'm pulling it out here so you can see. And this is the A3 oil paint paper. And if you cut this in half, it perfectly fits the new A4 plate. So I thought that was really good. Now, when I'm changing colors, I'll just clean the brayer off to the side somewhere, and I'll keep this because this will build up and be something really beautiful by the time I'm done. And it may take a couple days to get what I'm looking for, but, and then I can add another color. Now, the great thing about the oils is how they blend just so beautifully. And you can get these really nice gradations of color. And I could just pick some of this up, give my plate. So I can add another color. And I'm okay if the colors blend a little bit here because it gives me harmonization on my plate when I'm bringing my colors together. So I don't mind if this red mixes a little bit with that orange and that yellow that I put in there also. So if that does, if you want straight direct colors, just clean that off. And you can clean it by using paper and pulling some different prints. You can clean it with just a baby wipe, soap and water, something like that. Another thing that I found are these little chamois cloths that you can get, and I keep one damp, and I clean my plates with those a lot of times too. So they're really easy to clean. So I'm just applying it here, and then I can work this back in. And just create a really nice, beautiful blend here right on my plate. Now I could pull a print directly from this and give myself a really nice background that I can work with. And on top of that, I could continue to paint on top of it, either, you know, with a brush, or I could pull further prints. And the nice thing about the oil paints too, is because they do dry slower, I have all this time to work too. So I don't have to feel rushed. I don't have to sit here and worrying about where I'm going to go next. So once this is here, I can also create texture in these. So I can just use texture combs. You can use some of the brushes that you have. You can use anything that's not sharp, just to create different texture on your prints as well. And there's still enough on there that I can pick up some more. So this is more of an abstract type of print. And you can build layers on it. Just remember, the one thing with working with the oils, if you're building layers and trying to create layers on top of your prints, is that because they are slow drying, if you continue to build and add different colors, they could start muddying up the colors a little bit because they're not completely dry. So think about the colors that you're using and how you're putting together. Now you can see here that I've got those little marks that I made, and I'm still picking up some of the paint, and you can also see the texture of the paper that's in here. But now I can come back and add another color and add some more detailed in here. So I wanted to grab a little tool. I'm looking to see where it went. I have all kinds of little things that I like to play with. So I can use stamps. I could use, you can use rolls. You can use cardboard. I like to try to find things that I already have around here. And I can pick up from this palette and just add some extra color over here. Come in. Do a little random. And the nice thing about the gel plate too is that you can get a real thin layer. You don't want to build up a super thick layer of the oil paints though, for any paints for that matter, because when you have a thick layer of paint on here and then you press your paper and you push down, you're just going to smush those layers and they're going to run out. So you don't want to use a lot of paint. You want to keep it thin and you'll get better success at building up those colors. And I could use this as, like I said, as a background to then build something else onto as well, in an effort to create whatever kind of scenery that you wanted to create on here. So black. And just get a thin layer. Again, I'm just trying to find little things that I have around that I can create abstract shapes with. So I'm just picking up a little bit from here and stamping it right on into the plate. The plates are so sensitive. You could use a feather, you can use a leaf. So if you wanted to do some botanical prints, you can find some of those leaves, especially those of you who are starting to experience fall. I'm quite jealous because Florida doesn't have a fall, we don't have a fall at all. There's not even one to speak of. So you can use those beautiful leaves that you get and pull some really fun botanical prints, because it'll pick up every little detail of those little veins that are in the leaves, and it'll show all of that. So I pulled that way, and then I can continue just to overlap and pull up some more. So I could keep going and build up different layers. I can add a little bit to this first layer and pick up some more of that paint. It's really weird not getting feedback, hearing you guys. So I'm not used to just being totally quiet. So that's one way that I like to play with them and just continue to build up and add different colors. If you wanted to change and do a contrast color, you might want to let some layers dry for a little bit so that they don't have to be completely dry, but just so that they're not really wet, and that way you don't make mud or brown unless that's what you want. So I'm just taking one of my cloths right now and just cleaning some of this off, and it'll clean up really nice. Pigments will stain. It doesn't matter if you're using inks. It doesn't matter if you're using alcohol inks, acrylics, oil paints. If it's got good pigments in them, there are times that it will stain your plate. So, but that will not hurt your plate in any way in how it will perform. It'll still perform really well and will not affect your plate in any shape, form, or fashion. So you can also use your plate and paint directly on it. So I could take some colors and let's see, let me wipe this one up. Or sprayer. Get some of this off so I can use this again as a palette. I need a bigger desk because I always make them just take up all kinds of space when I'm printing. And I'm trying to keep it in shot of the camera too. It's always the challenge. But all right. So I get a surface there, at least I can work with. And when I'm done, I will take these and I'll clean them. So I'll clean them with some, like I said, either soap and water, or sometimes too, you might want to clean them with a little bit of mineral oil, baby oil. That'll work as well. And it'll just kind of take off a lot of the staining that you have. So with this, let's see, I had some colors I picked out here. So you can paint directly on your plate and then pull prints. There we go. I knew I had some blues out here, so I'm going to take some Prussian blue and a little bit of the ultramarine. And we could start painting an actual landscape right on your plate, however you wanted to create the landscape. So if I wanted to just create a horizon line that's not, because I'm sitting, so it's not straight. And I can just paint directly on here, just like you would on your canvas. And I'm just doing this quickly so that you guys can ask questions and I'm not taking up all evening. And we could create a sky. And if I wanted this to be a softer look, I could definitely use a softer brush. Come in and give it a nice little blend. So just adding a little bit of the blue. I'm leaving some open space in there too. And I can come back with some of that white that I had. And it doesn't take much, like Jeff said earlier, moderation. It doesn't, that's what I've learned right away playing with them, is it doesn't take much at all. So definitely just use a little bit at a time. And you're just kind of playing around. So I can make some fluffy clouds. add in a little bit of that yellow just to give it some brightness. And I'm just still using that same little brush, and that works really well, but you want to make sure. And then we could do a darker color down here for our water. And just play with it, build your landscape, your seascape. Come back in here with some of that white. And add our little horizon line back in. And then we could come back in and start adding a couple little waves. Again, I'm just kind of showing you guys some things here. I'm not trying to make a masterpiece today. If you took your time, you could really do some really fun little work with this. And then this could be an underpainting, just to kind of just give yourself, a place to practice and do a scale study. You could make this part of your underpainting. And the fun thing about doing it on the plate that I find is that, especially when you're practicing, you can get multiple prints at one time. If you're using a paper that has texture, that texture is obviously going to show. So if you had a smoother paper, you would get a nice smoother print as well. And build up different layers. A lot of times I like my second layer better, my second print more than my first. So then I could continue to build onto here. I could clean this. I could then start to build my background a little bit darker. I could build the foreground and just keep adding layers. If you wanted to make sure that your paper was landing in the same spot that you had it before, you could use a paper that's a little bit longer than your plate. And when you place your paper down that's longer than your plate, you can then tape 1 inch down so that you have a registration, and then you just keep flipping it back and forth so that you can do a registration marks. And that's a great way to make sure that you're always putting it in the same spot. Or if your paper is larger than your plate, you can take a piece of paper and put it underneath. And that way you can continue to put your paper on top to get the same registration marks as well. And then just continue to build up on there. So you can still come back in, you can add that. I'm mixing my colors now a little bit more than I wanted to. I don't want green. So, and you can still blend right onto your paper to get a different look as well. So we can there's different ways depending on what type of art that you like to work with. I am definitely an abstract artist. So I can do a landscape, I can do a portrait if I really want to spend the time and slow down and spend it, but that's not what I really enjoy doing. That's not my passion. So I love texture and layers and building up different things and just working more intuitively. So that's one of the things that I like to do. With the plates, How are we doing? We're still okay. I wanted to make sure that I give you guys time to answer questions. Another thing that you can do with the plates, which I think that you'll appreciate, is get this cleaned off a little bit so you can, because I want to show you that when it's clean, because they are clear and you can see through them, it's a great way to see. You could use it to do some different studies and do some tones by putting your pictures underneath and then painting on top of it. So let me get that. And pull this off. Because they are clear, and this one needs to really be cleaned, so I'm going to use a little bit of hand sanitizer real quick, and that will clean it a little bit better for me. And I just use my hands to clean the hand sanitizer. If you're worried about the oils, which if I'm going to be working in them all day, I would put on gloves and protect my hands that way. So the hand sanitizer, the alcohol in it will help clean that a little bit better. But because they are see-through, I could put a portrait or a landscape or any other kind of image underneath and then put your plate on top, and you can see that you can still see through the plate. So now I could use this as a reference, and I could come in and start painting directly on my plate using this as my reference if I wanted to work on some tonal studies, or if I wanted to paint in non-traditional colors, but I wanted to make sure that I kept this. It's a great way to just be able to practice and play, or when you're teaching others who are always intimidated and saying, well, I can't draw and I can't paint, but I really want to do this. This helps them to understand the scale and the tonal values. So print out a photo in black and white, put it up underneath your plate, and then you could come in with a paintbrush and actually start painting directly on your plate, and then pull the prints from there too. So you could definitely do that and add some different value from that aspect. So I encourage you to just kind of play around and see what you can do with it. And then you could just keep building up different layers and pull your print, and then try different colors. And it's a great way to try colors and see what's going to happen when you place them on here. So how are we doing on time? I know that you wanted to stop because Jeff has to go. So how are we doing, Elizabeth?
I think we should start to wrap up.
That's
and
what I was
this is
thinking.
just amazing. I love the idea of the photo underneath it because I'm more of a traditional artist, but I do love the abstract. It's
Right.
such a cool way because then you could, you know, as Jeff is saying in the chat section, if you lay that print then on a, I'm assuming you could lay this onto a canvas, you could print onto a canvas. Or
you could. The only thing with printing on a canvas is just like, so the paper that I'm using, you can see that it has that, let's see, this one shows up a little bit better. It has that texture to it a little bit, so you can see the weave. So just know that when you print on a canvas, if you print on anything that has texture, because you're printing and you're pressing onto it, the areas that are raised is what's going to get the paint the most. The areas that are in, underneath won't.
Right, but then this becomes a great underpainting.
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the things that I like to do with it, is to be able to use it as an underpainting. You could take this and now you just kind of, you could play with different colors and no, I don't like that, or no, I want to try, a phthalo blue instead of a Prussian blue, or different things. How are these colors going to mix together? I'm only using paper and paint. I'm not worrying about a canvas that, oh great, now I have to either scrape that off or let it dry or start all over. This is a great way to just kind of play and get started.
What is the largest plate that you have?
The largest plate that we currently have is a 12 by 14.
Wow. That was, I mean, between you and Jeff, that was like a powerhouse of a presentation. There was so much incredible information there. I'm glad we've got a recording of it, because definitely worth going back and taking notes on this. This was
Yeah, there's a lot that you can do with the gel press plate. I mean, it works with most any medium. So if you're not in, I mean, Jeff's definitely talking about oil today, but like he said, we use the Amsterdam acrylics too,
Mhm.
alcohol ink. So it works with most any medium. Just don't use anything that's solvent based or, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. Anything that's going to have a chemical reaction. So like crackle paint, you don't want to put that on there because it's going to react while it's on. But everything else you can use, and you can clean them up. They work really well. The Cobra paints, I'm learning how to work with oils in this fashion. I like to use oils over my acrylics a lot of time, or maybe add the highlights to some of the sculptures that I do. So that's how I've used them in the past. So this is kind of a new area for me.
When you use it with acrylic, are you using something to slow down the drying time? Because I could imagine it could dry, especially in warm weather, it could dry pretty quickly on your plate because it's thin.
It does. It dries really quickly, but that is one of the benefits of it because it does dry so quickly. The first layer is dry, so then you can add a second layer. You can add a third layer. You can add a fourth layer, and you can really build up some little fun designs. You can also, oh, I just lost my train of thought where I was going with that. So if the paint does dry on the plate, one of the things that I love to do is actually let it dry on the plate and build up different layers, let it dry, come back, add another layer, let it dry, come back and add another layer. I'm looking to see if I have any of those hanging right now. And I can create this whole different image that you could see. And then when you pull your last print, I'll take a color or a medium and just saturate, not saturate, but I'll put a thin, even layer on the whole plate and then put paper down and let it dry. So let it dry for a couple days, a couple hours or overnight. And then you slowly lift the print, and that wet paint sandwiching the dry paint between the plate and the paper reactivates or rehydrates that paint and adheses it. Really is what it does, is it will become an adhesion and it'll lift all those dried layers with it. So there's definitely lots of ways that you can work with acrylics as well as the oils on the paint, on the plate.
Amazing. Just in case the chat section does not transfer over to the recording, I'm going to read some of these questions and
Okay.
answers so that we have it on the recording. Sorry, there are about 5 of them, I think.
Yeah.
One of them was pastel binders because what Jeff had talked about at the beginning was the pigments are the same, but binders are different for the different mediums. So the question is, are pastel binders, are they liquid as well? And Jeff wrote, pastel binders come from resins or minerals that are liquefied and mixed with pigments to create a paste that is dried or baked into sticks. They have more pigment than any other medium. The drying time is the same for Cobra oils as they are for traditional oils. They begin to tack up after 24 to 48 hours. Although having used them in warm weather, they do tend to tack up sooner. So in Southern California, where it's dry, or I was painting in Southern France, they do tend to get tacky sooner, but they do have a nice working time. And they are dry to the touch after a couple of weeks, completely dry after 6 to 9 months. I don't know, Jeff, what this meant. We do the same thing at Royal Talons. All waste pastel is recycled back into the manufacturer.
Somebody had made a comment at how they use their old pastel waste and they use some distilled water to recycle them. And we
Oh.
do the same thing in the manufacturing. So when you're making a pastel, it's this great big paste. It comes from the same root word as pasta, right? It's old Latin pastellum. So we make a big paste, if you will, and then it literally runs through a giant pasta maker and makes these long ropes, and then they're cut up and baked. And often there are little end pieces or things that get damaged, and we recycle all that back in. We have these separate canisters for the waste pieces, and that gets recycled back in very much in the same process that she's describing she did in her studio. So I just was sharing that with her.
That's really awesome. So you get basically a neutralized color of some sort. I mean, I've done that with some of my,
So, yeah, so actually we do one color at a time when we're processing it. So all the waste from that one color gets cycled into that same production schedule. So
Oh.
it actually goes back in and creates more of the same color rather than like a gray or something, some from different colors. So it's all part of one manufacturing cycle.
that's fantastic. That's very cool.
If I can chime in here too, Elizabeth, if you're asking about pastels, pastels also work beautifully on the gel plate. Cleaning them, use a little bit of baby oil or mineral oil to clean the pastels off. So that's the, because they will they cling very well to the plate.
I'm assuming a
So,
soft pastel, not a new pastel. Like a Rembrandt pastel or,
you
any
can use
softer-
soft pastels, you can use pan pastels.
Oh, pan pastels. That
Yeah,
would be
you can
fun.
use graphite on the plate. You can use markers
Powdered
on the
graphite.
plate. You can use a graphite pencil.
Very
Yeah,
cool.
but wouldn't
Try not
that
to use like
mar
a
the,
super
wouldn't that mar the plate? You said it will mar very easily.
It's not, unless it's a super sharp pencil and you're scraping really hard, but like a chunky graphite, or even, I've got some, I'm trying to reach here. I have like, graphite pencils,
Mhm.
different, the graphite sticks, the wood sticks,
Yeah.
you can use them on here. Yeah. You just don't want to like dig in there. So.
Okay, that's very cool. Marty, do you have a question?
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, I was the one talking to him about grinding up my pastels, and I usually collect sort of a color family, like the orange and reds or whatever, and I'll grind them up and mix them with distilled water, and then I'll get a different color. And a lot of times it'll just be sort of a muted color because it's a mix of colors. Whereas he was saying that they use the pure pigments that they've been working on in that one color to.
Yeah, making it
use.
single pigment. Got
Yeah.
it. That's awesome. Okay. One of the questions was, once the gel plate is dry, the print is dry, can we use other mediums such as charcoal or pastel over it? And the answer is absolutely. Oh, oil
Yeah,
separation.
once it's dry, you would treat that the same way that you would. I mean, if you're using oil paints, you're going to treat it the same way that you would with any other oil painting, because it's going to have the oil paint on the paper.
So when you use watercolor on it, it doesn't bead up. It will create a flat surface too.
It will beat up. Yeah. If you
Oh, it
use
will.
alcohol or watercolor products on here, it will beat up. But that can create a fun little look as well, the little beaded look. But when you put the paper on there too, it disperses it. So when it disperses it, you get those beautiful washes, those watercolor little backgrounds and things like that when you put watercolor on there.
Love it. Okay, question about oil separating on the top of the paint, and that's called oil shed. As the paint ages, the surface tension of the pigment adjusts and sheds some of the oil. Some colors are more prone to this than others. It's not a bad thing, and typically only occurs in professional paints that don't use fillers. So that's a sign of a good paint. In the store, the tubes are stored capped up and the excess oil tends to gather there. So Jeff, does that mean that if in our studios, if we stored our paint tubes capped down, that would help to
That would
solve?
help to mitigate it, yes.
Okay.
Yes, or even laying the tubes flat helps, but in the store, often they're stored cap up, certainly in the racks. So
Yeah.
if any oil shed occurs, oil usually ends up gathering around the cap. But to the point I made in the comment, it's not a bad thing. And there are different ways to deal with it. You can do just what Cheryl did there and just mix it back into the paint and create a nice fat layer of paint. You can just use a paper towel and soak it up off the edges. And some artists like a really, thick, pasty-like paint. They don't like that extra oil, so they'll actually squeeze their paints out on an absorbent surface prior to using it. I've seen cardboard used for this. I've seen blotting paper. and it draws the oil out of the paint. And then the next day they go back and use that real thick paint as a result. So that's a way to reduce the oil content too.
A Nikolai Fechin technique. That's what he used to do.
Yeah.
And then you were talking about oil. Linseed oil is corrosive and it will eventually eat through paper. So for archival results, the paper must be sized or coated to protect the fibers of the paper from the oils. Is that true just for linseed oil? Does walnut oil, is that also a corrosive, or safflower oil?
Yes, so they're all corrosive to varying degrees. So any type of oil paint medium, you need to be working on a surface that has a gesso or is properly sized, is the word or term that we use for it.
Mhm.
And there are papers today. We make one for Cobra, for Rembrandt. There are other brands as well where the paper is pre-sized for oil paints, so you can paint directly on them without any preparation. But if you've got a sheet of watercolor paper or a type of printmaking paper, for example, that you really like to work with, all
Mhm.
you need to do is use a PVA is what I recommend, a PVA sizing or an acrylic binder or an acrylic gesso, and pre-coat those papers with those, and then you're good to go working on them with oils. Now, just for fun, you could use any paper in the Cobra and do the process Cheryl was showing. It's just that they won't be archival. You know, over a
Right.
period of time, the paper will slowly degrade. It could be beyond our lifetime. Really depends on how much oil's on it, but eventually it eats through it. So if you're looking to make a finished piece of work and archivalness is important to you, then you do want to size the paper or work on a pre-sized surface.
Okay, so
And
PVA.
if you're, oh, sorry. Go
Well, the
ahead.
PVA is, it's really easy to find at the art supply stores. And
Yes,
It's just
yes.
basically a white, kind of a,
It looks milky white in the
Yeah.
container. It dries clear. There are several brands. Some call it PVA, some have different names for it. We make a product under the Amsterdam line that's labeled acrylic binder, which is essentially the paint without the pigment. Any type of acrylic medium would also work. So if you had an acrylic medium or a gel, you could do a few coats of that on the paper and that'll protect it as well. You're just going to get better absorbency out of a binder or especially out of a PVA, and the characteristics of the paper will still be there, where if you use those mediums, you kind of lose some of that.
do you need to
Which,
coat both
which
sides
I-
of the paper?
What?
Do you need to coat both sides of
No.
the paper? Just one side? Okay, good. I'm sorry, Cheryl, I
Yeah.
didn't mean to.
No, that's okay. I was just going to say, if you do that process also of coating the paper, if you want it like a really smoother print, a crisper print without those texture from the paper, then that's the best way to do it, is to coat the paper first. And then that, just like you would, you know, a canvas or something else like that, gesso or the PVA, and then you'll get a crisper print because you're smoothing the surface of the paper.
Is PVA, is it self-leveling?
Yes, most of them are. It stands for polyvinyl acetate. It's a type of thermoplastic, just like the binder used in acrylic paints. It's also used in a lot of adhesives. A lot of over-the-counter adhesives are actually PVA. It's a substitute for the animal, based types of adhesives that were around for centuries. So it's certainly more kind in that regard. But yeah, it's fairly fluid. There are different consistencies out there, but most of it is the consistency of like an Elmer's glue or a matte medium.
Okay, great. I am saving this chat. So thank you, Marty, for telling me how to do that. That's very good to know. Zoni's asking, can you add certain other materials on top of the paint before printing, such as barks or saran wrap, etc.? So I'm
For
assuming,
texture.
yeah, texture. It's yours, Zoni. You can ask the question. It's yours.
Oh, it's fine.
On top of the plate.
Go
when
ahead.
you're
Yes,
printing?
please. Respond, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. You can put your paint down, and then you can use, just again, be careful of whatever you're using. You don't want to push really hard. So when you say
Mhm.
bark, just, take that into consideration. But you can use leaves, you can use bark, you can use saran wrap, cardboard. I love to recycle things and try to find ways of how that can create texture. So I keep cardboard around. bubble wrap, lace, doilies, any of that. So if it's really thick and then you try to keep that down and make that a negative space and print over it, just know that it's gonna, bend your paper and things like that. So sometimes you actually want to maybe press that into the paint and then lift it off and it'll leave some space.
Got it.
And
Yep.
just to confirm, we can use other mediums. We can use gouache and watercolor as well.
Yep.
And-
And with the watercolors, you can also put down a layer of gel medium sometimes. And while it's still wet, then add your watercolors. And that'll a lot of times allow you to
Oh,
get,
Yes. That's what I
yeah, and
thought.
brayer it out. And if you use pastels, or inks or something, that's another little trick I'll tell you, is I have found that if I have something that I want to protect and I don't want to brush it with a brush, I want to put a coating on it, like a varnish or something else like that. And I don't want to use a paintbrush because then it'll smear. And I don't want to go outside because it's raining and spray. I can layer brayer out a thin layer of medium on my plate and then press my paper into my plate, and I don't disturb the surface, and I get a good even layer across the whole thing.
Fun.
Amazing.
Great
That's
tip.
fantastic. Any other questions, you guys?
Just the last question, Liz.
Yeah.
The paper is at Arches. What were you using? Arches or Fabriano? Or-
Today, I was actually using, this is paper by Cobra. This is their oil paint paper. It's a water mixable
Oh.
oil color. So
Okay.
I was so excited because this is A3 and I was able to just cut it in half and it fit the new A4 plates perfectly.
Oh,
So I got
yay.
2 pieces out of one. I know, right?
Nice.
You can use that for any medium, Cheryl?
Well, you can ask Jeff. This
Yes,
is their
yes.
paper, so,
You
but I
can.
would think so.
You could use other things on it as well. It's not an oil primer. It's primed for the use of oil. So you could use other materials on it too. It comes in a block with really easy to remove sheets. And like Cheryl was saying, it comes in both A4 and A3 sizes.
And it's
Okay.
archival.
And it's
Mhm.
archival.
Okay.
Well, no, I take that back. So this is something that comes up with papers a lot. There's acid-free and there's archival. Typically, only 100% cotton papers are what we consider to be archival. Anything with a wood pulp or a pulp product or a combination with cotton is considered to be acid-free, but not necessarily archival. So this would not be considered archival in that sense, but it's certainly going to last our lifetime.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
That's good. I didn't realize that difference. Okay, great. Any other questions?
I have a totally unrelated to this question for Cheryl. Where did you get your storage bins that you have behind you?
Yeah.
Oh,
Good
these,
question.
Yes,
um,
does look great.
I got some from Hobby Lobby and I got some from Home Goods. So
Okay.
yeah, I keep
Thank
trying to
you.
find them because I do like that they're big and they're thick, so I can
Yeah.
store a whole lot of stuff in them. I've got
Super
3
cool.
of them over
Maybe
there.
beauty supply too.
Oh, wait, and these, if you got like little inks and stuff, these
I do
are
have those,
essential
yeah.
oil but I've got my distress inks, archival inks, and alcohol inks in them, so.
Cool.
So
Thank
alcohol ink is good too, right, Cheryl?
Yes,
use
yes,
that.
alcohol
Okay,
ink
I have
can
that.
do some really fun things on here. And if you want to explore what else you can do with the gel press plate and different mediums, make sure you check out Gel Press YouTube channel because I have a team of creative artists who are
Press
producing
YouTube.
videos every week. Yeah.
Is that in our chat, Gel Press Studio?
It's just, if you just look up, you could go to gelpress.com and that's
Okay,
our
just spell it
website.
for me. Just spell it for me. I'm gonna put it in.
GELPRESS.com.
.com on YouTube.
Yeah.
Just go to YouTube.
Oh, well, that's our website. So I was trying to tell you the easiest way to get there.
Okay.
And there'll be a link to our YouTube. But if you are on YouTube and you search Gel Press, it'll come right up.
Okay,
Good.
great,
Thank you.
cool. All right,
All right.
amazing.
Sounds
You guys.
great.
I'm gonna remove your
Amazing.
spotlight.
Yeah.
This was phenomenal. Thank you guys so much. It was absolutely fantastic.
Here is Jeff Olson and